Aloha SOC 333 students. So I'm just knocking out my videos right now for the first week. And this video is going to be about your week one material. So week one's topic is Intro to Criminology and Intersectionality. This is a survey of criminology class. So you might have been expecting to learn about traditional historical aspects of criminology. However, because of our ethical focus and because of my expertise using intersectionality, this will really be the foundation of our class. So, for a lot of folks who are studying sociology, you may not know what intersectionality means because it is more, historically, it has been a term that has really been a foundation of women's studies more than any other field. So if you don't know what intersectionality means, you're going to find out in this class. In particular, for week one, you will be reading an article by Patricia Hill Collins. And although it's from 2015, she's writing not only about contemporary issues related to intersectionality and what the term means, she's also discussing what she thought about or how she conceptualized intersectionality in the late 80s, early 90s, when the term was first coined by her as well as Kimberly Crenshaw. And so if you have taken an Intro to Women's Studies class, you've probably read something by Kimberly Crenshaw because she is also cited as being one of the first researchers and scholars to use intersectionality. Her work tends to be longer, and so for our purposes, I wanted something a little shorter and chose to incorporate Patricia Hill Collins' work. All right, so what does intersectionality mean? It means you need to think about what you research, not just looking at one particular thing. You want to look at race, class, gender, sexuality, place of origin. You want to look at different aspects of identity and what that means for individuals and their everyday lived experience. And so you can't just say, well, Patricia Hill Collins is a Black woman and she's a lesbian, so she is more oppressed than someone who's a white woman lesbian, right? You can't just add or subtract aspects of oppressed identities to somebody's lived experience and say automatically that person is more oppressed. You have to think contextually about how all of these various aspects of identity are sort of operating in people's everyday lived lives. And so that's one aspect of intersectionality. You also want to think about what all of these aspects of identity, so race, class, gender, country of origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, what do all of those things mean for how we understand social institutions? And if you're a sociology major, you should know what a social institution is, but often sociologists use that term without ever defining it. And so a social institution is anything that exists in a society, for our purposes, our society, that helps to sort of control or regulate our lives. And so if you think about our class in criminology, the criminal system in so many ways regulates our lives. And so we know what's good or bad, or what we think is good or bad, based off of what's legal and what's illegal, right? We think about who can vote based off whether or not they have a felony conviction. So prison and laws impact our everyday lives and how we understand the world. So that's a social institution. But if we take a step back and we think about that term more broadly, we can apply it to other things that don't necessarily relate to criminology. So if you think about education, that is also a social institution. Education impacts your life, how you understand things. So let's take, for example, you've completed K through 12, you have your high school diploma, you decide not to go to college, and you think, okay, education no longer is a part of my life. I'm not in school anymore. So it's not a social institution that regulates my life. However, that's not exactly true. So this could be something as simple as you having to prepare what time you go into work in the morning based off of the traffic that occurs when parents are dropping off their children at school. So I used to live in Makiki for a very long time. I lived like a block and a half from Punahou, and I would have to figure out what time Punahou was starting and what time those parents were dropping their kids off at school. I had to take all that into consideration when I was planning my morning, right? But I have no affiliation with Punahou, and yet it's still impacting my everyday life and how I live my life. You can also think about that same example, that person who completed their high school diploma and is no longer in school, and you can think about their career opportunities. Their educational attainment, it significantly impacts what type of employment they'll have access to, right? And so education, it really impacts so many different aspects of our lives, right? And that makes it a social institution. If you have any questions about what a social institution is, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to have one-on-one conversations with students about that. All right, so going back to criminology and the criminal system as a social institution. So what does that mean for intersectionality? Well, it means that the various aspects of identity that I just mentioned, so race, class, gender, country of origin, all of those things impact the criminal system as a social institution. So we've known for decades now that the way people of color are treated within the criminal system is very different, right? So we know that the war on drugs, for example, significantly increased the amount of policing that was happening in urban poor areas that were primarily lived in by people of color. And so that meant if they're over-policed, that they're more likely to get arrested and go into the criminal system. We also know from Michelle Alexander's work and the new Jim Crow, this means that when you have a Black person committing a crime and a white person committing a similar crime, the Black person is more likely to have their case go to a federal circuit court versus the white person is more likely to have their case go to a lower circuit court. So what does that mean? Well, that means we know that federal circuit courts are more likely to have harsher sentencing than lower circuit courts. So automatically, that Black person who went to federal court is going to have a harsher sentence. So it may not necessarily be that anyone who is working in the criminal system automatically thought, oh, this Black person needs to have a harsher sentence than this white person who committed a similar crime. But subconscious biases mean that Black folks are significantly more likely to go to these federal circuit courts and therefore have harsher sentencings than their white counterparts, okay? And so that's just one example based off of research that we as criminologists have had access to since the early 2000s. But there are other things happening as well that we'll discuss throughout the semester. So age is important, gender is important. Again, all these aspects of our identity, all these intersectional things about our identities, they matter when we think about how the criminal system in the United States operates, right? And so this is becoming increasingly a more mainstream way of thinking about the criminal system. And we see documentaries like 13, for example, where it's now mainstream to accept the fact that we know that there are inequities within the criminal system, but especially within prisons in terms of how people of color are treated, right? And the way that they're policed. But there are other things to think about in a critical way as well. So we're starting to see this issue of criminalizing poor immigrants from developing countries. And that's another way that these aspects of our identity, such as our country of origin, that matters when we're thinking about how the criminal system operates. And so that's just a little overview of how criminology and intersectionality sort of mesh together so perfectly for our class. And that's how we'll be thinking about surveyed criminology throughout this semester. The second reading you have this week is by Hilary Potter, and she's actually making this connection. So Patricia Hill Collins is just saying, here's this thing called intersectionality that I helped create, and here's how you can apply it or not apply it to various research projects. And then Hilary Potter is saying, hey, I'm taking intersectionality and all this work that's been happening by other Black scholars for a really long time, and I'm applying it specifically to the criminal system. And then I also want to cover the historical context of prisons. And so I have a TED Talk with Ashley Rubin here that you'll watch. And that's about all I got for you for week one. I know that was a lot. Don't forget to look at the rubrics, the reading list, the syllabus for our class. You got a discussion leader project sign up here, discussion board one to do. And of course, if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself to me and your classmates, you'll get extra credit for that. And when you've made it to the end of week one page, you will be done and you can go to week two. That's all I have. Thanks, guys.